Welcome to our Bright Hour service, in which I'm reading one of my mother's talks that she gave to the midweek meeting in Shrivenham in 1987. We're worshipping here with our friends in church from Churchill Church and with people all over the world. But first, let's listen to a very well-known hymn which Brian is kindly playing to us. We're also thinking of Angus, who accompanied Brian last time, who at this time is working in South Sudan with the United Nations. But I did hear that he was playing his pipes to a children's orphanage, so he's still playing music. But let's listen to this wonderful hymn. In 1986, my mother went to Australia on a holiday. She went almost every year for about 13 or 14 years after Daddy died. And this is the talk that she wrote when she came home. As I say, she shared it with the ladies at Shrivenham, so I'm sharing it with you. And it's called Granny's Quilt. When in Australia last November, I went one morning for coffee with the mother of one of John's friends, Margaret Parsonson. She's a deacon, like our church stewards, in the Uniting Church. And during my visit, she told me a story, a true story. And this is it. In 1876, Margaret's grandmother could find no work, so she emigrated to Australia on her own, leaving her home and country in search of a better life. She'd been used to making little silk slippers for Indian children out of scraps of fine silk, and so among her few belongings, she took with her a bag full of the little scraps of silk that she had left over. And during the long 3-month voyage, she made a full-size patchwork quilt using over 7,000 pieces. In 1888, there was a big exhibition of patchwork in Melbourne. So she entered her silk quilt that she'd made on the voyage, and she won a special medal for the best quilt. Unfortunately, a bit later, she came upon hard times, and she sold her beautiful quilt very cheap because she needed the money. But Margaret's sister still has the medal. And early last year, she saw an advert in the paper about an exhibition of patchwork quilts in Sydney that July. So she wrote to the officials and told them the story of her granny's quilt winning the medal in 1888 and how it was lost. The organisers wrote back asking if they could borrow the medal for the exhibition, and they put it on display with the story of the quilt. It was also printed in the brochure, and an appeal was made for any information about the quilt, but unfortunately it was never found. Well, Margaret was sad that the quilt had been lost and couldn't be handed on, So she decided to make each of her 11 grandchildren a patchwork quilt to hand down to their children. And in 1988, 100 years after that first exhibition, Margaret began her first Granny's quilt. And when I saw her, she was on her 8th one, only 3 to go. Each one is full double bed size. Each is a different design and has got a name like springtime, winter. Each has a hand-stitched name on a label, and there's a second label with the name and the date made. They're kept flat on her spare bed, and when they come, the children will be able to choose which they want. As soon as Margaret told me the story of her grandmother's quilt, I thought there must be a message there. And as I thought, well, patchwork has become very popular in recent years. I suppose in Victorian days it was a way of making something useful out of odd bits and pieces, but that hasn't left us even today. And thinking of patchwork in another way, when we moved to Guernsey from Somerset in 1964, we went over the year before for a day. And that was our first ever flight in a plane, £10 return from Bristol. I remember looking down on the island and seeing all the glass houses, the little fields, the clusters of houses, the beaches, making up a patchwork island. It's never ceased to intrigue me, especially when I was able to identify the places we were flying over. Our garden at the manse in Guernsey was a big one and was on the flight path. So when we used to take Jenny and John to the airport going to college, we'd see them through departure, get home in 10 minutes, pick up a tea towel and wave it as the plane passed over. Only once was one of them sitting on the right side of the plane to see me. But I love a window seat in a plane to be able to see the patchwork land when flying low enough. It makes you realise the vast variety of the beauty of God's world. Mountains, snow-cut snow, desert, forest, lakes, rivers. And another time I saw a patchwork land was at the annual Strawberry Fair in Australia. And it was a huge all-day fair with strawberry pancakes and cream. And we took my youngest grandson, Danny, aged then 6.5, with his friend. And John and I decided we would have to have a helicopter ride. So I was sent with the 2 boys, and we flew round the area, and the patchwork of the ground below showed up beautifully through the windscreen and sides. And the little boys sat like statues, drinking it all in. It was far too noisy to talk. But we don't, of course, have to fly to see our patchwork world. We see it all around us in our garden, in the parks and the countryside. It's there for us to enjoy, a vast variety of different colours, shapes and mediums, just like Granny's patchwork quilt. We read in Genesis that God created the earth and saw it was good. He saw the patchwork scene he had made, and he was pleased. And this is what we think of when we remember our first hymn, all things bright and beautiful, God made them all. And we think of the wonderful woman who worked in the slums in America with the people who were poor and who said, we are saved by beauty. And so let's give thanks to God for the beautiful patchwork of his world. But secondly, I want us to think about how the patchwork of life is like Granny's quilt, with all our individual lives and our experiences being the patches. Margaret's granny left her home, family and country to go to Australia, and she must have found life and people there very different from what she had left behind. But I think she'd already had the basis of a better life, that piece of patchwork, before she left England. She'd been making silk slippers for children in India, I presume through some ladies' missionary society in Victorian England. And she was like the many people, and I think of Dorcas in the Bible, who we read about in Acts chapter 9, who spent all her time doing good and helping those who were poor. And you remember Dorcas died, and Peter raised her from death, and no doubt she continued her good work. So there's the patchwork of beauty, there's the patchwork of life, and there's also that in the patchwork of life, the granny who made the quilt met lots of different people in her new home in a strange land. And I found that Australia is a very cosmopolitan country, and I want to tell you of a few people from other lands who've settled in Australia and who I met. There's Henry, who was from a Jewish background, and he sponsored John when he first went out. He had a second-hand antique shop in the oldest wooden shop in Melbourne. His father and mother were German Jews, and his father had the death stamp branded on his arm from concentration camp days. He'd been lucky to escape the death chamber and emigrate to Australia. There's Christine, a girl from Estonia, daughter of another war victim with the most terrible scarring to his face. There's Elizabeth, John's mother-in-law from East Germany, whose grandparents and parents were shot by the Germans when she was 14. She trained as a nurse after the war and emigrated with a free passage and £10. There's Red, John's friend in business, whose family came from the Lebanon. There's Ashley, John's brother-in-law, who married a wonderful girl from Singapore, and sadly she died, and he's married a lady from Malaysia, and they have a big family. That's just a few people in the patchwork of life in one tiny corner of the world. And so we remember the variety of people and backgrounds that make up God's world. And we remember that Jesus was a friend to everybody. He ministered and taught to his own people, the Jews, and he taught to the Gentiles wherever they were. God intended all kinds of people to live together in peace, and through Jesus we can do this. Jesus touched and healed the leper, the lame, the blind, the dumb, associated with sinners, outcasts and foreigners. He loved and helped anybody in need, no matter who they were. And when Jesus was criticized for talking for Zacchaeus the tax collector and going to his house, he said, "I have come to seek and save the lost." Yes, God has no favourites. And so we move on to think a little more about the patchwork of life and work. Margaret's granny was a housewife, a homemaker, and brought up a family, as so many of us have. But think for a moment of all the other sorts of work that's done all over the world. Each different kind of work, each occupation is another patch in God's quilt. Last November, John took me to Kangaroo Island for 3 days. And there we found a wonderful world. It's the 3rd largest island in Australia. Half an hour's flight in a little plane and landing in a tiny airport that reminded me of our visits to Alderney in the Channel Island. No big shops or department stores, but people were farming and fishing. But there was no rabbits or pests and no air pollution. We found our way to a eucalyptus distillery. It used to be the main industry, and the oil is made from a special species of eucalyptus grown only on Kangaroo Island. All the power for extracting the oil from the leaves and for the steam from the leaves comes, and for the steam engine in the distillery comes from wood burning kilns. And the farm was run by a family in what I thought were rather Heath Robinson conditions. They've sheep and other wildlife. And the farmer's hope and ambition is that in the future the whole island would revert to its natural state of growing the special trees for oil and sheep farming, a safe refuge for the wildlife. We visited one farm, miles and miles from anywhere else, called Clifford's Honey Farm. So we brought back gifts to take the family from Clifford's Honey Farm. It was very good. During that short visit, we found a marron farm, a big black crayfish considered a delicacy, a duck lagoon, and we found fairy penguins. All of these making different patches in the quilt as to God's wonderful world and how people live and work. But I must tell you about something I didn't enjoy, about a visit to the casino in Melbourne. My friends took me to the top and we looked out on the patchwork of Melbourne, but then they took me through the ground floor. I was staggered at the lavishness of everything. The cabs and porters, exclusive shops, certain areas where men couldn't go if they hadn't a suit and tie, and a huge stairway cordoned off for the use of multi-millionaires, leading to a special gaming room. I wanted to run out of it as quickly as possible. But I realised this was another part of the patchwork of life. It was a boiling hot day with inside lighted with dim glittery lights. I found it very spooky. Not all the gaming tables were in action, but I was very worried to see so many people playing with dice and counters for money. I found it so sad and depressing. I couldn't get out in the sunshine soon enough into God's real world, even if it was in the middle of a big bustling city. Nevertheless, I knew that many situations and places like this and many others are part of the patchwork of life. Let's not forget, in conclusion, that life can be as beautiful as the quilt made by Margaret's granny and the one she's making for her own grandchildren. How? The answer is in Jesus' command, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. Margaret's making a beautiful quilt for each of her 11 grandchildren, so they'll have an inheritance to pass on. It's nice to have things passed down, a token of remembrance, isn't it? The Jews all through the years remembered Abraham and how God led him out into a new life. The woman at the well talking to Jesus remembered Jacob saying, "Our ancestor Jacob gave us this well and all drank from it." God gave us a special day, Sunday, to remember him in worship. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And Jesus at the Last Supper, he shared with his disciples, gave us the words we use in our communion service. Do this in memory of me. And he says to us, remember me as part of your inheritance, the Lord, and hand it on to your children and to their children. Remember my teaching, my commands, my life given for you. There's not a sparrow that falls without my Father knowing about it. You're worth more than many sparrows. You are valued, you are loved, every one of you, loved and known by name. So remember me. Let us love one another, and then the patchwork of life will be as beautiful as the granny's quilt. We close with the well-known hymn, Come, let us sing of a wonderful love, tender and true, out of the heart of the Father above, streaming to me and to you. Wonderful love dwells in the heart of the Father above. Jesus the Saviour, this gospel to tell, joyfully came with the helpless and hopeless to dwell, sharing their sorrow and shame, seeking the lost, saving, redeeming at measureless cost. Jesus is seeking the wanderers yet. Why do they roam? Love only waits to forgive and forget. Home, weary wanderer, home. Wonderful love dwells in the heart of the Father above. Come to my heart, O thou wonderful love, come and abide, lifting my life till it rises above envy and falsehood and pride, seeking to be lowly and humble, a learner of thee. Amen.